The diplomatic vessel cut the amber sky like a fingernail through honey, leaving a thin, trembling wake of refracted light that made the colony's corrugated shelters shiver. It hovered, ceremonial and slow, a thing meant to be seen, polished hulls that never touched their own engines, flags that had the patience of law, and a single raised balcony from which the capital dispensed judgment like rain. They had brought her to be spectacle. They had painted her as a joke. Aliana stepped down onto red dust and methane-slick stone, wearing nothing of a queen except an eccentricity of dress the court had once loved. The fabric chimed, tiny metal discs threaded through the hem, so that every breath of wind set a faint score of sound against her calves. In the capital, that sound had been coquettish, a deliberate spark to distract. Here, beneath the low, copper-heavy clouds, the sound read as fragile, almost ridiculous. Children pointed with wide, unself-conscious fingers. Some adults pretended not to notice. The governor's steepled smile was practiced and thin. The observers' faces were leveled with the polite gravity of people who measured power in pasted-on etiquette. They had called her the Fairy Queen. The phrase landed like a cotton net over the colony, meant to tangle, meant to make them laugh at their own supposed backwardness. The governor declaimed the gift of her presence, as if presentation alone were a demonstration of superiority. But Aliana did not move like someone who expected to be served. Her hands, thin, stained with varnish and flux rather than jewels, found a crate of tools before a valet could offer a glass of some ceremonial beverage. She knelt in the dust, palms already smelling of wire sheen, brass filings, and the faint mineral tang of methane condensation. Mockery ricocheted off her shoulders like light. She did not look for the source. In exile, there is an immediate economy of belonging. Aliana learned it with instruction. Where to sleep so the nights kept you warm, which children would trade a scrap of music wire for a lesson in soldering, which old technician preferred to talk about arc calibrations late at night while needles traced star charts across the communal table. She set up a workshop in a repurposed maintenance shed under a battered sign that still bore the faded crest of a failed mining cooperative. The space smelled of oil and old rain. The hum of an ancient atmospheric relay kept time like a patient metronome. She called the place her workshop rather than her studio. Language meant something here. The word studio might have been an invitation to performance, and she rejected the invitation. Work was resistant and real. It resisted flattery. It required patience, repetition, the stubborn acceptance of inevitable error. Aliana's hands moved like someone who expected to be answerable to metal and current, to gauges and the cant of mounts.
She learned to coax the machinery, the way one coaxed a voice back into being. Gentle heat here, a careful bend there, the whispering of flux to make the bonds accept each other. Where the court had taught pageantry, the colony taught craft. Children came with broken toys and tiny telescopes. Technicians brought intermittently functioning relays and battered comm lamps. Aliana taught them to read the hum in a way that was almost a language, how a relay's pitch flattened when a contact flamed, how a brittle solder made a panicked high-frequency rattle before it cracked. She did not teach theatrics. She taught the dignity of returning a thing to its own terms, of making it whole in the same form as before its hurt. Mockery continued. Cartoons were stitched into the market's rag sellers, little drawings of a fairy queen tinkering with a kitchen pot, while the imperial fleet rained down benevolent guidance. Men with the capital's insignia told jokes that were carefully tuned to cut, never direct, always edged with propriety. "She has metallic shoes," the children joked. "How inventive for a queen." Women who had once sold fabrics to court courtiers now cast sideways looks meant to serve as warnings. Fall back. Do not let a thing that could shame us be seen to matter. The colony had learned how to absorb insult and make it into caution. And yet, some looked at Aliana with a different kind of attention, an attention that shrugged off mockery because it was interested in the work. Corin watched from the far side of the workshop, his elbows smeared with grease and the thin white film that clung to someone whose days were spent inside systems. He had a way of watching that carried no slanted laughter. Instead, it carried the slow calculation of someone testing tolerances. He was practical in the broadest sense. His humor was spare, his smile rare, a thing saved for the right moment. He had come to the colony after renunciation. Rumors called it abdication or exile, or a deliberate turn away from some nameless courtly honcho. The stories about him had a musical unreliability. People loved the idea of an ex-figure slipping into obscurity. Corin did not tell stories. He fixed things. When he finally spoke to her, it was about a relay. A harmonic drift, he said, as if the words belonged to the air between them. Your 3B array is micro-tracking. You're getting a phase slip on channel 2. Aliana did not look up. Her fingers were holding a blade of solder near the tip, and she had a small blue-lit diagnostic probe balanced between her thumb and index finger. Phase slip, she echoed, the words like a small, pleased note. So the limiter isn't responding fast enough. You'd like to try a soft retention? He smiled that small, economical smile. I'll try not to disturb your choreography.
They began, side by side, the slow choreography of repair that had an intimacy all its own, tools exchanged in silence, the passing of a hand bridge, the way one leaned closer when reading a concealed point. Their bodies fit into the same machine the way two strangers might find a rhythm while carrying a table down a corridor. Corin's hands were wide and steady, calloused at the base of the fingers, with a faint scar across the knuckle of his right thumb, where a metal shard had once glanced off his skin. He moved as if the world had taught him the economy of force, never too much, never too little. Even their small rituals mattered. Coffee was a sacred thing in the colony, thick, bitter, with a lingering iron note from the communal boilers. Corin made his coffee in a battered pot with a dented spout that had belonged to a ship's kitchen. He poured it for Aliana on their first official night of collaboration, and she took it like a treaty. They drank there in the half-dark of the workshop, while the array's hum kept a steady, benevolent pressure at the back of the skull. "Do you miss it?" she asked once, after a night of soldering and soft laughter. He tightened a bolt and watched the tool light paint halves of his face. "Which it?" "Everything you left." Corin's fingers passed. The bolt nearly turned. For a moment, something about him unspooled, very small. "I left to find a morning that doesn't come with proclamations," he said finally, "to taste something that doesn't have a footnote." She looked at him then, not like someone who wanted to unpack his past, but someone who recognized the way he measured his life in less showy metrics. Their collaboration deepened with an economy of gestures, a repair at midnight, a shared cigarette of thin synthetic tobacco, the way they both hesitated before touching a component that had been fragile, and then together coaxed it back to steady hum. The workshop became a place where their hands could converse. Conversation itself was often in the quiet exchange of technique. Aliana taught him the way to read a coil under backlight. Corin taught her to feel when a bolt needed a whisper of force rather than a grunt. He liked the way she solved problems not with bravado, but with an acceptance of the machine's stubbornness, as if a device's temper was its truth to be learned rather than tamed. They were not lovers at first. No quick romance blossomed in the bright way that happens in plays. It was quieter, a shared look when someone brought an impossible scrap, a note pushed under a bench. Try the flux recipe from Sector 12. Smallness became the architecture of their intimacy. The colony watched with a mixture of wary hope and open skepticism. People were hungry for stories that did not end in disaster, and the sight of two competent hands at work together was a luxury they could afford to admire. The Empire, however, never let a narrative be allowed to die simply because a colony preferred it.
A week after Aliana had begun teaching a class on relay harmonics to a knot of teenagers, an Imperial calibration ship returned. Not the same ship, but one of the capital's lesser ceremonial vessels, painted to show that it traveled with purpose. It carried observers who wore the neutral gray of officialdom, the type who took notes as if notating a ritual. Their arrival was a bureaucracy made manifest. The test was framed as benevolent oversight, a calibration trial, they called it, an event to ensure the colony's relay networks were in alignment with imperial standards. But the ritual language was thick with suggestion. A calibration trial, when staged by the capital, meant that someone had judged you insufficiently impressive. It was a soft form of humiliation, an opportunity for the capital to demonstrate its benevolence by correcting your faults in front of your neighbors. Aliana understood this. She watched the Imperial envoy from the workshop window, taking in the way they spoke in tiny agreed phrases, as if language itself were a tool they could calibrate. The observers walked through the colony with their tablets and their polite curvatures of posture, asking for logs and system reports. They did not ask for teachers, they asked for proof. When the governor arranged the public demonstration, he spoke in the language of uplift. "This is a chance for the colony," he said, the words like varnish, "to show the capital what we've achieved, to receive guidance." Aliana felt the lie of that sentence as if it were physical. Guidance in such contexts was often a lever. The capital did not give without taking. Commendation was often the first line in a contract. If she took the capital's guiding hand, the cost would be something measured less in credits than in the way the colony would tilt, toward performance, toward spectacle. To accept the capital's nurture was to allow the capital to own the narrative of your competence. She could have avoided the test. She could have kept her hands in the privacy of her shed and let the observers parade past without a demonstration. But she recognized that refusal would itself serve as a concession. It would be read as an admission of incapacity, or worse, ingratitude. Instead, she decided to answer on her own terms. She would present competence rather than costume. The calibration trial was staged on a communal field beneath a scaffold whose metal bones gleamed like a public jaw. Imperial technicians raised a module at the center, a diagnostic node, an artifact of the capital's design language, sleek with the ceramic black sheen of high-density alloy and an eye of blue receptor. Its purpose was to ping the colony's array, to insist on a standardized response. The spectators came in 2 concentric rings, the colonists at the periphery, the governors and official observers in the front, their faces set in that soft, studying disapproval the capital preferred.
Governor Merrick recited the official litany about collaboration and protocol. The Imperial observer spoke as if describing weather, neutral, detached. Curiosity hummed through the crowd like a low current. Children perched on crates and gave Aliana and Corin small thumbs-ups. Someone had painted a tiny banner with their name, and a pair of tools crossed beneath it. It was the sort of defiant tenderness that a small community could afford. The device began its calibration with a polite chime and a projection of required tolerances in pale light. It was a test in 3 stages: detection, synchronization, and adaptive correction. Each stage was meant to confirm the colony's alignment with the Empire's standards, but the device had been designed to be performed for. It assumed a single operator, an operator who would respond to its prompts with a mixture of obedience and ceremony. It expected a certain choreography of lights and beeps, and in its code it contained the capital's conceits, a willingness to exaggerate minor misalignments into public evidence of backwardness. Aliana read the module like a book that tried to hide its lack of humility behind a sheen of showmanship. She and Corin positioned themselves opposite each other, elbows resting on the same battered workbench. The module sent out a soft pulse. The colony's arrays answered. The observers nodded at each other with the satisfaction of people who had set a trap and were watching to see if the prey would take it. Then the device hiccuped. Not in a dramatic way, not with fireworks, but with the quiet, betraying whisper of a stabilization loop that had been pushed beyond its expected tolerances. The module's receptor curled its light into a thin, worried filament. Aliana felt the change as if someone had pushed a hand into the back of her throat. The capital's technicians murmured, and Observer made a note. The expectation in that moment was for the colony to fail and for the capital to step in, to demonstrate correction. The ritual was moving like a line of dominoes toward humiliation. Aliana's hands did not tremble. She slid a thin probe into the module's access port, and it fit with an accurate, almost loving click. She listened to the device like a doctor listening for a heart. The hum changed. There was a subtle second harmonic, a ghost signal that threaded through the primary carrier. It was the tell of a microphase lock settling on a false attractor. In ordinary circumstances, a technician might accept the module's calibration, note the discrepancy, and mark the record. In that situation, under the porcelain smile of the observers, that mark would be read as evidence of the colony's lack. "You're aware," Corin murmured, not with warning but with the tone of a man who splits a difficult task into plausible motions, that they expect discomfort, that they'll be looking for gestures. "I know what they'll be looking for," Aliana said.
She let her voice keep the tone of someone discussing humidity, a mechanical aside. They'll be listening for a value that matches their textbook, but the module is responding to a local resonance. It's not wrong, it's local. "Then let's make local clear," Corin said. They had a choreography for this too, but not the gilded choreography of the capital. Their dance involved less spectacle and more honesty. They would coax the module toward the colony's natural resonance, rather than force it into the Empire's expected rhythm. It required patience and craft, gentle retempering of the module's internal filter, a whisper of heat at a solder point that would coax an arrested capacitor back to life, the precise folding of a microcoil until its field matched the array's preferred phase. Aliana's soldering iron sang a thin, honest note. She added flux with an exactness that made the technicians in the front row shift a degree toward disbelief. Corin applied torque in small increments,
his hands steady enough to suggest that whatever he had left behind at the Capitol, he had not left steadiness. The device shivered, corrected, made a noise that could have been an apology. When the module's receptor finally brightened with a steady blue, there was a collective inhale from the crowd so big it felt like a small ocean pulling at the shore. The Imperial observers glanced at one another. No one had expected competence so unadorned. The Capitol's instruments, designed to find fault, found instead a harmony unfamiliar to them. It did not match their textbook, but it worked. Aliana stepped back then, letting Corin finish the last delicate operation. She watched him as he closed the module's panel, the snap of metal smoothing into place like a sentence folded shut. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt something like being seen, not as an object of comedy, but as a presence with skill. The sensation was a small, dangerous warmth. The observers wrote longer notes. The governor, who had hoped for an opportunity to boast about his colony's pliancy, now had to reconcile his narrative with a demonstration of civic competence that did not come under his stewardship. There were no fireworks. There never were, not in the quiet places. But there was acknowledgement, a small, legal sort of nod. After the trial, the Capitol's envoy stayed longer than protocol required. They wanted to catalog the specific methods used. It was the sort of attention that looked like praise and smelled like leverage. The observers were careful in their language, talking about commendation and possible integration of local practices into broader network protocols. In the governor's office, the phrase possible integration was written as if it were a gift wrapped in bureaucracy. Aliana felt both satisfaction and a prickly caution as she watched the envoy's polite circumnavigations of her little workshop.
The modular file they took was not sterile. It was annotated with her fingerprints in a way she could not scrub away. Recognition, she understood, could become a rope. The colony, however, celebrated. They celebrated with the smallness that belonged to them, a potluck of dried lagoons and spiced coffee, children running with strings of wire like banners. Someone set up a small stage and played a song that was only half a tune and wholly private. Aliana danced once, clumsy and joyous, and Corin laughed in the way that moved his shoulders. The celebration did not erase the possibility of future consequences. It offered for a night the feeling of warmth. Before dawn, when the copper sky had not yet hardened into day, Corin found her in the workshop, cleaning out a set of filters whose ceramic had become speckled with methane residue. The light was torn into soft bars by the slats of the shutter. He offered her the dented pot of coffee with its quiet, stubborn steam. She took it with a hand that still smelled of solder. "You handled it well," he said, making the appraisal sound like an inventory. "You handled the bolt on the wrong torque specification," she replied lightly, because she wanted to keep the world measured. "You don't bridle enough." He shrugged. "I know how to drive things to peace." She set the cup down carefully and cupped the pot between both hands. For a moment, the machine-worked world fell silent. Outside, a wind pushed against the colony's perimeter and made the antennae sing softer. Inside, the workshop hummed, a low, safe sound. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. The question was not about the observers alone, but about what it meant to have eyes from the Capitol learning how you practiced your craft. The word "come back" held the possibility of gifts and of shackles. Corin did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his work jacket and pulled out a ring. It lay in his palm, a band of tempered alloy with a sigil sun-worn almost smooth. For a second, Aliana's breath hitched. There were stories attached to such things. Rings were not merely metal, they were compact proclamations. He turned the ring like one might turn a thing that needs polishing, showing not the sigil, but the scar that had nicked it. "It's half a keepsake," he said, "half an old habit." "Does it belong to someone?" she asked. He met her gaze for a length of time that was longer than any congestion of gossip should allow. "It belonged to a life that paid for what it promised," he said. "I traded the promises for more manageable mornings." There was mystery lodged in that sentence, and Aliana could feel the potential weight of it against the fragile joy of the colony. She did not press him. There were certain exits from power that were not clerical. They were lived, sleepless, and costly. Whatever Corin had left behind might yet cast a shadow over this place, but his hands, at least, were here, and they fixed things.
He was not an instrument of the Capitol in any way she could yet see. They worked together in the days after the trial, accepting commissions from the colony and mending the kind of everyday apparatus that kept settlement life humming. A nutrient filter for an old hydroponic rig,
a comm hub that sang off-channel during storms, the delicate balancing of the communal heater's pressure relays. Each repair deepened the web between them, trust braided from competence. People began to come not just for mechanical assistance, but for a kind of counsel that was tied to the rhythm of making. Repairs offered lessons that were also forms of moral argument. If you respect the machine, it respects you back. If you force a system into a guise, it will punish you later. Quietly, an imperial envoy wrote a commendation. It was formal, language varnished with courtesy. The paper arrived under the governor's hand with an implied smile. The capital had taken note. The colony had been acknowledged. The document offered potential resources to integrate local innovation, conditions and details to be discussed. The phrasing was careful about agency. It smelled faintly of paper that could bind a pocket. The arrival of the commendation had different effects in different mouths. Some read it as vindication, a way to gain more robust repair parts, improved fuel imports, the training materials the colony had been denied. Others heard in the same words a lever. Recognition was rarely unconditional. The capital's offers, unless understood as purchase and not benevolence, cost the colony its story. Aliana read the commendation in the dimness of the workshop, its soft glow from the diagnostic display painting lines across the paper like a mapping of possibility. She touched the printed capital seal with both hands, as if to feel its reality. It was inviting. So was the capital. It had, after all, sent an envoy to watch them work. She thought about the children learning to solder, about the way the community had come together to celebrate a competence that refused to be spectacle. She thought of Corin, the ring in his hand, the way he tightened bolts like someone who had practiced containment. She felt the small, heavy question that had always sat at the corner of their days. To be acknowledged was to be known. To be known by the capital was to be circumscribed. "Don't make any public pledges," Corin said when he saw her looking at the paper for more than a moment. There was in his voice a kind of soft insistence, the kind that came from inner knowledge. She folded the commendation and slid it into her satchel. "No," she said. The word was more than a refusal. It was a manifesto. Word of the commendation spread like the steady, careful ticking of gears. The capital's glance had landed and lingered. People started to ask aloud, what would the acknowledgement mean for them?
Would it mean parts and improved filters, or would it mean curfews and tours, where children would be taught how to act like the capital wanted them to act? The observers asked for one more thing before they left, a demonstration of the colony's emergent innovation, a system they'd been proud to call their own. Not as a public spectacle, but as an exchange, a ritual of showing that the colony could offer something to the empire in return for its resources. It was a classic imperial maneuver. First, you demonstrate benevolence by noticing, then you solicit commodities as if they were mutual. Aliana felt the weight of the request. She thought of the little people who had soldered under her direction, of the adolescents who had learned to untwist stubborn wiring with patience rather than brute force. She thought of the workshop's dim light, and the way children learned rhythm in the back, tapping out beats on repurposed valve bodies. There would be a demonstration. They would present a device they had been building, a cooperative relay interface that allowed multiple feeds, life support, comms, hydroponics, to prioritize energy in the colony's favor during storms, without throwing the entire grid into disarray. It was practical, honest, a thing that owed its existence to the specific weather and need of the place. It was not glamorous, but it worked. They rehearsed the demonstration with the intimate care of practitioners preparing for a small rite. The module was tested and calibrated. The interface's code was written by a selection of technicians who preferred curly braces to solemn speeches. Corin and Aliana took the lead, not because they wanted to be front and center, but because they had built much of the system, and because their hands had learned the device's temperament. On the morning of the demonstration, a methane rain turned the sky into a soft, trembling gauze. The colony gathered under shelters. The imperial vessel rested like a dull tooth in the air above, its microphones catching the sound of the rain and amplifying it into a ceremonial hush. The observers' delegation took their place with the same patient poise as before. A thin camera rig tracked the event with official disinterest. Aliana stood by the interface, while Corin adjusted a small relay coil that hummed with the pulse of the system. Their hands worked in tandem. The demonstration began with a small simulated storm, an influx of consumption demands, a throttling of external input, a stress test meant to show the colony's resilience. The interface smoothed the spikes, rerouting power to essential systems without collapsing comms or starving the hydroponics. The audience watched as the device shivered and then sang steady. There was a moment, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in the interface's feedback loop when the system hesitated. It was not failure. It was an invitation to look at what would be done next. Aliana's fingers found the adjustment she needed.
She leaned towards Corin and, for once, permitted herself a private grin. They had a short exchange, a single line of private technical repartee that was more like a hand placed against a familiar hinge than an announcement. "Tap the secondary phase. It's looking for a reference," she whispered. "On it," he said. He did something small. He tweaked the phase, increased a micro-threshold by an infinitesimal amount that most people would never see. The interface found its footing, and the system's hum returned to a melody. The observers scribbled, some with frustration in their faces, others with the puzzled furrow of minds confronted by a method that worked but did not match doctrine. The demonstration concluded without fireworks, but not without consequence. The captain of the envoy offered a formal commendation in earnest voice. "The colony's interface is a fine example of adaptive practice," he said. "The capital values innovation wherever it arises." Aliana heard the words as both praise and a question posed in careful grammar. The capital valued them, yes, but valued them in a way that implied expectations. Use us and you will prosper. Be independent and you will be neglected. The choice would be presented as the colony's own, but the capital's hand would be felt everywhere. Corin put his free hand on the bench and did not look at her when he spoke. "They will propose integration," he said. "Be ready with conditions." Aliana folded the words like a small tool. Conditions were a language in which the capital excelled. They bound the grateful to protocols that read as benefits and felt like bindings. That night there was a knock at the workshop's door. An Imperial aide asked to speak with Aliana alone. He carried the politeness of an instrument and the smell of clean air. He read from a script, offering a formal invitation, an opportunity to discuss possible terms for the exchange between colony practice and capital resources. It was diplomatic in form and transactional in content, recognition in exchange for certain commitments. "Come to the capital, discuss terms," he said, eyes like small coin lenses. "There will be advantages for your people." Aliana closed the shed door behind the aide and held the dimness like a small cloak. Outside, the colony's laughter muffled the distance between the practical and the ceremonial. She considered the invitation the way one considers a machine's warranty, full of promises that often bore conditions printed in small type. She thought of the children learning to solder. She thought of Corin's ring and his mornings. She could see clearly three outcomes: acceptance on the capital's terms and the slow transformation of her workshop into a showcase, refusal and the capital's annoyed indifference, or negotiation that preserved autonomy but required strategy she did not yet have. Corin found her then, and she handed him the invitation without preamble.
His thumb traced the printed seal in a way that made the paper crease faintly beneath his finger. "If you go," he said, "you will become something they can put on a shelf." "And if I don't?" she asked. "They'll keep trying different shelves," he replied. "Recognition is a tool. It can be a ladder. It can also be a cage." For a long time they sat in silence, the relays hum a hymn. Outside, the colony breathed. Someone began to tune a rusted guitar. Aliana weighed the invitation in her hands, the paper suddenly heavy as a wrench. The capital's attention had opened a possible avenue for better parts, for steady fuel shipments, for the infrastructure her workshop could not manage alone. It had also opened a ledger where autonomy might be traded for convenience. She thought of the governor, of the children's tiny grins when their telescopes picked up a faint comet, of Corin's fingers tightening on a bolt. She thought of the idea of being seen authentically. What stranger thing was there, if not being seen without becoming property of the seer? That night, after the aide had left and the rain had thinned to a breath, Aliana and Corin worked until the diagnostic monitors glowed like constellations. They did not talk about the Empire in terms of theory. They spoke of bolts, of stray capacitors, of habits in code that made devices think in narrow ways. The workshop was not a place for speeches. It was a place for repair. And in repairing things, one also rehearsed the possibility of repairing fractures of other sorts. When dawn etched the sky with the first thin knife of amber, there was a knock at the door that neither had expected. Two of the Imperial envoy's aides stood on a threshold, their faceplates tucked back in a way that made them less like instruments, and more like people unwilling to be seen as less than polite. They had a second communique. The capital had taken note of the colony's ingenuity,
and wished to make a formal proposal. They spoke of restoration in a voice that was regal and thin, an offer to bring Aliana back into the capital's light, with a status that matched their earlier courtly designations. But the restoration came with stipulations that smelled of scripts and rehearsed obligations. Aliana felt the air tighten like a relay coil. To be restored would be to return to a life with crowns and courtiers, and an audience for every motion. She had worn that life before, the glitter and the performative niceties, and she had left them. To accept would mean surrendering the sanctuary of a workshop where her hands made rules rather than complied with them. To refuse would mean receiving the capital's attention as a threat. Corin's mouth flattened at the edges. He had always been a practical man. Now his practicality had the tone of someone who understood both levers and the cost of strings. "If they offer you restoration," he said, "they will give you an altar and a leash."
They will applaud, and somewhere behind the applause there will be a ledger. Aliana folded the note and slid it into the pocket of her work apron. "Then I shall consider which is more valuable, their applause or our mournings," she said, aloud, more to test the sound than to offer conclusion. Corin did not answer. Instead, he ran a hand over the ring in his pocket and felt the small dent that had caught the light from the demonstration, his knuckles white as he closed them around metal that meant more than any single story could hold. The future, for a breath, felt like a suspended relay, caught between two possible circuits. They had earned the capital's attention by refusing to be a joke and by being what they were, competent makers of small things that mattered. Attention had come, as attention does, with a gloss of promise. It was not yet a choice, it was an entrance to negotiation. The colony slept fitfully, aware that the capital's gaze had become a kind of weather. In the corner of the workshop, a relay blinked like an eye that had learned not to blink in public. Outside, the amber sky softened, and the rain receded to a memory. Children would ask about the capital and dream of parts they might one day hold. Adults would calculate leverage. Aliana and Corin, two people who had become adept at transforming instruments into allies, understood that the next move would require a kind of craft larger than any device they had ever coaxed back to life. They would need to craft a negotiation, a petition, a boundary, something with the tensile strength of a good alloy. When the Imperial aides left, their polite smiles in place, the colony's silence folded back into everyday labor. There were more repairs to be done, more filters to recalibrate, more nights of shared coffee and quiet handwork. Yet under the surface, a tension had been seeded, a subtle current that would not easily be dispelled. For the first part of that day, Aliana worked at her bench, hands busy, mind quietly cataloging contingencies. Corin assisted, fingers sure and precise. They were partners in the arithmetic of small victories. Later, a message arrived, short, formal, and carried by an emissary who had once been used to the capital's corridors. The wording was careful. The Empire would like to extend an invitation. It was not phrased as demand. It did not wear the armor of coercion. But the sentence was a hinge. The emissary's eyes lingered on Aliana in a way that made language feel like a tool with an edge. Aliana read the message once and slid the thin paper into the small wooden box where she kept her soldering wire. The box was old, dented in a way that matched the dent on Corin's ring. She closed it and looked at him across the bench. "Do we decide now?" he asked, though the question was not exactly for the two of them. It was for the colony, for the children, for the object of their small gatherings. "We decide what we can own," she said. The sentence was small and blunt, and perfect for the workbench light. They spoke for a long time after the emissary left. They did not choose openly. They cataloged options, wrote margins in their heads, weighed the promise of more fuel against the cost of being curated. There was a sense, raw and patient, of a decision forming not as a sudden revelation, but as a strategy modeled on the same attributes that made them good mechanics: patience, careful testing, the willingness to accept incremental correction rather than theatrical overhaul.
Corin stood nearby, his jacket creased and smelling faintly of resin. He kept his hands empty but visible, the same way a craftsman leaves his palms open to show he carries no tricks. Marek spoke of negotiation as though it were a technical problem. "We can set the terms," he said.
We can take parts and stipple them across the settlement so they don't arrive all at once. We can set up oversight. That's oversight, Governor, the older woman corrected. They're not handing out parts, they're handing out fences with the keys. Who oversees the oversight? A younger technician, one of Aliana's students, stood up with the blunt courage of those who have seen a system bend and wanted to know how to change its axis. If we take their kit, he said, they will expect standards. They'll want us to document methods, to make our improvisation legible to them. They'll teach us to do things the right way. That right way isn't wrong on its face, but it isn't ours. We don't want to trade our margins for their manuals. The debate unfurled like a schematic. Components proposed, resistances noted, ground lines worrying at the edges. A woman with 2 small children whispered that the colony needed certainty for the next planting cycle. She would take a risk for stability. A group of teenagers, eyes bright with that reckless half-hope only the young can carry, wanted the capital's training programs and the chance to leave for better stations. A few people simply wanted to be left alone. Aliana kept silent for much of the meeting, which unsettled some. She had, after all, been the colony's accidental star. But silence was a tool she had learned to use. When she did speak, people listened not because she had courtly pedigree, but because she spoke with a voice shaped by practice. If we accept anything, she said, it should be with the same care we use when we adjust a filter. We don't reforge the whole housing because one seal leaks. We find the seal, we craft a patch, and we load the part ourselves. She unfolded the commendation slowly and let the paper hang between her hands like a small instrument. Integration as the capital means it will want to fold our methods into its manuals. I do not distrust their engineers. I distrust being cataloged. A pause settled. It wasn't the dramatic quiet of theater. It was the kind of silence made when everyone remembers the cost of being cataloged. Corin spoke then, and his voice was not the voice of a man who wished to play the court. It was the voice of someone who had calculated weights and judged tensions for longer than he cared to admit. We can propose terms, he said. Limited acceptance, direct delivery of parts without a standing presence from the capital, training comparable to what they offer, but under the guidance of a community board. No show tours, no courtiers with cameras. Merrick's jaw pressed flat. The capital will not likely accept all of those caveats.
Then we negotiate what we can, Corin answered. Negotiation is not surrender. It's the engineering of a solution that won't collapse half a year from now. Conversations fractured and reassembled like circuits in need of reflow. They sketched out a list, shared ownership of improvements, a clause ensuring that the colony could refuse visits to public institutions, a demand that any training materials be co-authored by members of the settlement, and a request that technical blueprints remain in local control rather than uploaded to the capital's registries. It was not a perfect plan, but it was a plan that treated autonomy as a thing with tensile strength. When the meeting broke, people drifted back into their routines with a new line of calculation to carry in their heads. The storm-run work of the day swallowed up argument. Children returned to bright metal toys patched by Aliana students. Hydroponic racks were checked and rechecked. The communal heater's pressure relay received the steady ministrations of a caretaker who had been awake too many nights. Aliana and Corin walked back to the workshop together, through the narrow alleys where condensation had frozen into thin, glittering sheets. The conversation they had held in public now compressed between them into something private. "You did well," Corin said quietly, offering a small smile that did not ask to be more than it was. She tilted her head. "I have been practicing the economy of refusal," she said. "One needs to be skilled at no the way one needs to be skilled at solder. There is both art and calibration to it." He stopped and looked at her. "They're asking for conditions, and you're asking for something else, to keep the shape of this place." "I am asking," she said simply. That night they sat under the soft glow of diagnostic displays and wrote a list, not only of demands but of the terms under which those demands might be accepted. It was a way to make the intangible hold weight. They wrote in the language they knew best, pragmatic terms, timelines measured in cycles and deliveries rather than political rhetoric. A delivery schedule for parts tied to performance metrics decided by local engineers. A clause guaranteeing that any visiting teams would work under the supervision of community-selected technicians. A penalty clause in the event that the capital tried to rescind any portion of the agreement without community consent. It was practical work. It felt to Aliana like filing a petition and like tuning a delicate coil at the same time. There was dignity in the act. To make your own terms was to refuse to become someone else's demonstration. Corin hesitated as he added a line to the margin. He had been resisting a deeper confession, not because he feared shame, but because the things he carried from his past were less like trophies and more like cautions.
When he finally spoke, it was with the exactness of someone who has documented failures carefully.
"I told you I left," he said. "I haven't told you everything." She did not ask him to. The past, in their line of work, was often a lien that could be called at any inconvenient moment. He produced the ring again, the alloy dulled from use and nicked along one side where a tool had once slipped. "This was not a coronet," he said, "not in any romantic sense. It was a band used in the administration of a small provincial circuit, the sort of ring that granted you a desk, not a throne. But the people in the capital have a talent for myth. When a person with a story steps into a small place, stories will make them into larger things than they are. I figure the capital wanted to make a parable, and they found us the setting." Aliana listened as he described bureaucracy as a machine with teeth, slow-consuming, efficient at turning people into diagrams. "I signed once," Corin said, "a ledger that allowed the remapping of an agricultural allocation. It seemed efficient. We called it rational. It wasn't. People were uprooted, moved into dark shelters under the argument of optimization, and the thing that happened, what I couldn't live with, was that the ledger had no apology. The numbers mattered more than the faces. I left because I could not be numbered." His confession was not melodramatic. It landed like a small, clear part. It contextualized his renunciation without mythologizing him. Aliana touched the ring with a fingertip. "You left because your hands couldn't render human beings as data," she said. He nodded. "That, and because I wanted mornings where the coffee wasn't administered by a clerk who noted what I drink." They sat in the soft sound of the relay until their lists of conditions for the capital had weight and shape. Then they sent the written document, clear, precise, uncompromising in its small way, back with the aide who had arrived the first time. The emissary accepted it with the kind of polite detention that suggested the capital had not expected a list this particular. Weeks passed with the slow hunger of negotiation. The capital's replies came in bureaucratic waves, each phrase to look as if it were a concession. They offered a pilot program for parts delivery timed to the colony's cycles, but insisted on an initial audit. They suggested training modules but wanted a permanent liaison posted for oversight. To each suggestion, Aliana and the community replied with calibrated revisions. They accepted some provisions and refused others. They traded and traded again, always trying to keep the lever in their own hands. Then came the day the envoy returned with a different tone. They arrived in silence, the light from their ship refracting through the methane haze into a host of thin, austere beams. The captain of the envoy, an officious man who had spoken with varnished courtesy on the first visit, did not bother with small talk. The capital had reviewed the colony's conditions.
"We are prepared to agree," he said in a voice that smoothed the words as if ironing a crease, "on our terms." There was an edge under the politeness now, the barely phrased understanding that our terms carried a deeper meaning than the pilot program, that agreement might mean redefinition rather than reassurance. He laid out a compromise that read in legal tone like a gift, integration with an initial autonomy clause and a 3-cycle review. 3 cycles, the captain said casually, as if the phrase itself were benign. After that review, the capital will make a recommendation. "We value your innovation, Miss Aliana. We would very much like—" "To take credit," a voice interjected from the back. "To share," the captain corrected. "To graft this method into the broader network so that other colonies may benefit." When the envoy left, leaving paper like a thin crust in his wake, people felt the same small, bruised relief one feels when a machine hums after a difficult repair. It worked, technically. They had secured some protections. But in the marrow of the settlement, people could not shake the private sense that a mechanism had been installed in warning mode. Aliana and Corin took the documents to a private table and read them under a lamp until the letters blurred into a map of possible futures. The clause that mentioned review lodged in both their throats. "This is not clean," Corin said. 3 cycles of observation. It allows them to install routines by which they can later classify deviations and then correct them. "It gives us parts now," Aliana said. "It gives us a better filter and enough seed to rotate the gardens through lean months. We buy the community some security." "And that security can be rescheduled," Corin said. A small bitterness creased his voice. "You know what they will call us if we sign. They will write case studies about how the capital integrated local ingenuity into empire-wide standards. We'll appear in a manual under a paragraph about best practices. We become footnotes and not authors." She thought of the children lining up to solder under her instruction, of the way their precise fingers were starting to learn an ethic of repair that had nothing to do with spectacle. She thought of the community board they'd negotiated and how it would hold some power, but likely not the kind that could stop a capital decision made under the pretense of harm prevention. "We can put in measures," Aliana said. "Force majeure clauses, community veto on any on-site presence beyond the liaison, a clause that requires community co-authorship on any manuals, and," she hesitated, measuring the rhetorical weight of the next idea, "we can include an appeal to the networks of colonies, let them know that this was negotiated with consent." "Which is to say, call witnesses to our autonomy," Corin finished.
They drafted riders, sub-clauses threaded like fine soldering along the main document, tightening locks on any clause that might later be used as a lever. They insisted on transparent accounting, on the right to refuse a visiting team, on penalties for the capital should it attempt to take material control without explicit authorization. It was the best they could engineer within the language the capital used. When they sent the new terms, the days folded into a waiting that felt like the coil of a relay under strain. The colony went about its work. Filters were mended, relays tuned, children's laughter threaded the alleys. But all the while the settlement listened for a different kind of sound, the approach of a ship, the clack of official boots, the hush of a broadcast. The reply came in the form of a visit by a senior envoy whose faceplate was minimalistic and whose smile had been refined by 1,000 diplomatic rooms. He offered praise and a minor concession. The capital would accept the community veto in principle, provided the community established a technical review board whose members were approved by the capital. It was a soft swallowing of their demand for autonomy. The capital would nod at their desire for self-governance, but reserve the right to vet those who governed it. It was bureaucracy's favorite trick, devolving power while placing the mechanisms of oversight into the hands of the grantor. In the humming light of the workshop, Aliana placed her hands on the table as if to feel the pulse of the settlement through the wood. Corin stood behind her, and for a moment the past and the present sat in the same room, the ring in his pocket warmed by his palm, the diagnostic display's soft pulse like a heart. He brought his hand over hers and rested it lightly. There was no grand vow in the gesture, only the quiet promise of companionship in the face of work. They called a second assembly and read the updated terms aloud, paper rustling like dry leaves. The debate regained its old rhythm, but now every voice sounded honed by negotiation. Some wanted to accept, some wanted to decline, some wanted to delay and gather more evidence. In the end, the vote was close. The community chose a middle path. They would accept an initial, strictly delimited program of material assistance, filters, a set number of relay boards, training credits to be allocated by the community board, but they would refuse any permanent liaisons or the uploading of proprietary designs to capital registries. The technical review board would be populated by locally chosen members, and the community would reserve the right to withdraw from the agreement if any clause was violated. It was a compromise.
It was not a victory of pure autonomy, but it was a collective decision made by a place that had learned how to weigh cost against principle. When word was sent back to the capital, the colony expected the usual bureaucratic entanglement, petitions, minor delays. Instead, the capital responded with what looked like acquiescence, and then with a gesture that felt like a hand poised above a scale. A formal invitation was extended to Aliana once more, not to accept a courtly restoration, but to come to the capital as a technical consultant, where she would demonstrate village innovation to imperial engineers. It was phrased as honor and opportunity, and in a footnote of tone, as a show. Corin found her later in the workshop, the light flat and honest. He had been unusually still all day. "I can go with you," he said at last, "not as escort, but because there are things they might draw from my past that are not convenient for the colony." Her eyes met his. For a moment the air between them was simply filled with the hum of the relay. "Is your past something that can be rendered safe?" she asked, "or is it a thing they will use the moment it serves them?" He looked at the ring in his hand and then slid it onto his finger. The action was small and private. "I do not know," he said, "but there is something I must tell you before you consider leaving on their invitation." He traced a scar on his knuckle, the same place where a shard had once grazed his skin, and taught him the language of care. "I never wore a crown," he said, "but the people of the planets like a good story. There was a project, a governance mesh in an outer cluster, that I helped design. It worked until it didn't.
When it failed, I realized my role in authorizing decisions that were brittle had real consequences. I renounced the post because I could not in good conscience keep signing things that displaced people on the promise of efficiency. She listened to his confession the way one listens to a delicate diagnostic, not with judgment, but with the attention that can sing out the hidden harmonic. If they make you into a symbol, Aliana said, they will try to use you to persuade me. If they cannot persuade me, they will try to use your past against us. He nodded, the gesture a small mechanical compliance. I know, which is why I have to go, not because I want them to like me, but because no one should be surprised by the shape of a lever. I will not be surprised. That way, if they try to pull it, I can be there to misalign it. She reached out and placed her palm over his, then left it there. It was an intimate, almost religious gesture, a pact of smallness. Then go, she said. But let us go to them with the clarity of people who have not sold their mourning. The capital received Corin not as an exile returned, but as an oddity whose presence could be turned into an argument. See how the empire includes metagades. See how innovation arises beyond the capital's direct nurturing.
Corin's being allowed into the capital's halls did not mean he was safe from their ways. He sat in rooms that smelled of citrus polish and formal coffee, while engineers asked him questions that were practical and then subtly rhetorical. He answered with the patience of someone trained in systems, what broke, why it broke, how to prevent it. But he did not give them script for claims they might weaponize. Meanwhile, Aliana remained at the workshop, the colony's rhythms intact. She taught, repaired, counseled. She sent dispatches to the capital and delayed decisions that might strip the colony of its voice. The capital's lights flickered over the settlement now with a new frequency, attention with geologic patience. Then, not long after Corin returned from the capital, an imperial envoy came bearing a notice that was less polite than documents had been until that point. It was a request phrased as a necessity, a technical audit to ensure safety and standardization. The message had the soft tyranny of non-negotiable phrasing, wrapped in concern. We must ensure, the envoy said, that structures under the pilot program meet safety standards. Aliana read the note in the dim light and felt a small, acute anger. Safety standards had a way of meaning control. She convened the community board, and they read the clause together. It stipulated that certain systems would be inspected by teams that had final say on whether particular components were acceptable under imperial law. It was, in effect, a backdoor into the colony's autonomy. They protested. They sent a rebuttal that reiterated their right to local control and insisted on the presence of community-selected witnesses during any inspection. They received an answer not as paper, but as a different kind of pressure. A public broadcast from the capital naming the colony as an exemplar of integration and subtly applying praise that doubled as pressure. Praise, it turned out, could be as constraining as a promise. Aliana and Corin met in the workshop bench under the diagnostic glow, and for the first time, the weight of their choices felt palpably like a thing one could set on the bench and examine. They're testing the seams, Corin said. They praise, they then appoint the inspection committees, and suddenly the rules are theirs. We cannot allow that, Aliana answered. Not now, not after we've just won a sliver of self-governance. She thought of the children tapping out a rhythm on valve bodies, of the small rituals of morning coffee and shared cigarette. She thought of the warmth of community that had nothing to do with courts. She felt the design of the capital, its skilled, long-time patience, like a slow tide. They drafted a countermeasure. It wasn't a thrilling military strategy, nor an outright rebellion.
It was a suite of small, enforceable practices, public documentation of every inspection, live-streamed to a network of colony affiliates, the placement of independent auditors chosen by a coalition of neighboring settlements, and a technical clause that prevented the capital from altering any designs without explicit co-approval by local engineers. They sent these back as amendments with the calm of those who understood the detail of leverage. The capital responded with glorious ambiguity, praise, a minor concession, and the sudden announcement that an imperial ambassador would visit in person to celebrate the burgeoning partnership. The ambassador's visit was framed as ceremonial, an attempt to make the power imbalance look like mutual admiration. The day the ambassador arrived, the sky was a dull sheet of methane light. People lined the path, not in obsequiousness, but in the manner of those who await a stranger with tools at their belt. The ambassador's carriage was less ostentatious than the capital ships, no balconies, no ceremonial flags, because the capital had learned to disguise its instruments with humility. The ambassador smiled, took in the greets, and offered a speech about common good. But beneath the speech, the colony read the fine print. The capital had agreed to the community's auditors, but had quietly suggested that those auditors be trained by an imperial institute. Training, they had discovered, was another hinge. It was then that Corin did something that changed the tenor of the encounter. He walked into the open amidst the ambassador's retinue and removed his jacket, exposing the ring on his hand. He did not hold it out as an offering. He did not brandish it as a token. He placed it openly on the table where an onlooker could see it and said in a voice without flourish, "Whatever stories the capital tells of me, let this be clear. There are parts of the machine I will not authorize. I will not be used to name ignorance as innovation." There was a hush. The ambassador's smile shifted then, the kind of subtle recalibration that comes when an instrument's needle moves from green into yellow. Corin did not bow. He stood like a man whose ledger of conscience had been balanced and whose entries were now public. Aliana stepped forward after him and laid her hand on the ring. It was a small ceremony, not of crowns, but of accountability. "We will accept help where it preserves our capacity to decide," she said. "We will not accept partnership that removes our voice." The ambassador's face did not harden. It did something more dexterous. It reorganized. He offered more rhetoric about collaboration and community-led models and promised to relay their preferences to the Capital Center's committees. The crowd applauded in the small ways they had learned: a raised hand, a shout, the beat of a makeshift drum. The ambassador left with his delegation, and the ship's engines hummed up into the amber atmosphere.
After the formalities, there were days of uneasy truce. The capital sent supplies, but also observers. It granted some of the colony's requested parts, but also set up a portal that would stream technical manuals unless the manuals were specifically redacted. The colony's auditors were trained, not solely by the capital, the colony insisted, but with a coalition of peers from neighboring settlements. The capital grumbled, recalibrated, and then proceeded with the business of empire, which had always favored patient accumulation. Aliana and Corin continued their work at the bench with a renewed urgency, to render the colony's autonomy resilient in small, practical ways. They set up encrypted local networks, and they made sure the hydroponic nodes could operate in a low-dependency mode. They taught children redundancy and documentation, how to make a fix with improvisation that left a paper trail. They were making not a monument, but a method. One evening, as methane rain fell in thin sheets and made the antennas sing like distant violins, Corin sat at the bench and took the ring off. He turned it slowly in his fingers, watching scars define its surface. "The capital will always look for a lever," he said. "It is what empires do. They offer ladders and then measure the rope." Aliana set down a spool of flux and looked at him across the small island of light. "Then we make our ropes thicker," she replied. "We braid them here. We teach the children to braid them too." They made a list of contingencies: who would speak if an envoy arrived unannounced, who would serve on the emergency board, which lines of communication were to be kept out of capital registries. These were small things, but everything they had learned suggested that small things could resist large motions when they were well made. In the months that followed, their compromise held, though sometimes strained. The capital kept its eye on the colony, a patient instrument of notice. It did not try to crush them. That wouldn't have been the empire's first choice. It tried instead the subtler arts: appeals to prestige, offers of career advancement for the youth, invitations to ceremonial forums. Those enticements were polite as a surgeon's scalpel. Then, in a letter folded with the capital's precise hand, an unexpected line appeared, an offer of restoration for Aliana, this time unaccompanied by performance. It promised a status that would guarantee certain resources in perpetuity, a title that would allow her to petition directly for the colony's needs. The paragraph read like a bribe that wore the soft face of honor. Corin read the note and felt the old exhausted fear that leaders often feel when their private choices become public assets. "If you go," he said, not pleading but cataloging risks, "they will assimilate you into their story. They will make your presence useful as propaganda.
Your hands will be photographed. Your methods will be cataloged. Our children will be invited to demonstrations." Aliana waited as she had everything, not with sentiment, but with the same careful hands that could tell if a coil had been wound too tight. "Restoration has the ring of a ladder," she said. "It offers resources in exchange for being curated." He took her hand and idly rolled the ring between finger and thumb, a motion so small that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not looking for the language of touch. "You do not need a crown to have influence," he told her. "You need a bench, a set of people who know how to make, and a town that will not allow its own story to be sold for parts." She folded the letter and slid it into the satchel with a commendation. Her fingers smelled of flux and rain. "We will answer," she said, but not with an immediate yes. The capital, in the end, accepted their conditional refusal as a kind of victory, a polite phrase that implied compliance without immediate compliance. It would keep the restoration on the table, to be offered again when strategy shifted. In the ledger of the empire, the sum of their resistance and concessions would be recorded as a trade. Months later, when a new imperial observer arrived with a less showy presence, they came to survey the interfaces and leave behind a cache of parts that the colony had bargained for. As they worked together, an alarm of the kind that lives in the margins of all networks tripped, a relay blinking against a nominal threshold. It was a small problem, and the sort that could reveal either negligence or genius, depending on the hands. Aliana and Corin fixed it in the quiet way they had always fixed things, together, with mutual steadiness. The observer watched, curiosity replacing pretense. He took notes that seemed less evaluation than catalog. When the repair was done, the machine's hum returned to its familiar, reassuring frequency. The observer cocked his head and smiled, a smile that had a new skill now. It folded praise inward so that it might serve another sentence. "You make a compelling case," he said. "The capital will admit its mistakes and learn." Corin's reply was measured. "Learning should not come at the cost of erasure." The observer's eyes darted to the ring on Corin's finger with a quick, appreciative glint. The capital had noticed him as another instrument, after all. He was both a danger and an asset. In the files of diplomats, people like Corin were always converted into parables, sometimes for demonstration, sometimes as warnings. Later, alone in the bench's light, Aliana and Corin sat side by side. Outside the workshop, the antenna sang with the night's rain. The relay blinked steady in the corner, a small pulse that felt like a heartbeat. The colony hummed with its own life. "Do you ever regret leaving?"
She asked him, not asking whether he regretted the renunciation, but whether he regretted the choice to stay and make a life that would keep calling him to resist the capital's engines. He shook his head slowly. "Regret is for those who are done with learning. I regret things that could have been less expensive to people, but I don't regret the mornings or the work. Those mornings weren't a small thing." She touched the ring impulsively and then withdrew her hand, like someone who had almost placed her palm on a warm machine. "We will not be naive," she said. "We will keep our bench, our children, our evenings of coffee. We will accept help as far as it helps us make our own choices." He squeezed her hand, the pressure exact. "And we will be ready for whatever they do next." She looked up through the open doorway, where the sky wore its mercury light, and a thought crossed her like a small shock. There was an irony in being called a fairy queen by a capital that loved simple labels. The label had been meant to humiliate. Instead, it had become a marker of something the capital could not easily script, the stubbornness of a person who chose craft over show. Late that night, as the colony slept in waves and the rain had slowed to a whisper, the imperial ship adjusted its orbit above the settlement. It was not a dramatic act, not a saber rattle. It was diplomacy in the form of a recalibration. The ship's sensors lingered, a reminder that attention could wait. The empire had not been defeated. Its patience was a machine on a long program. It would continue to look, to evaluate, to offer and retract its offerings. It would make proposals that smelled like gifts. Aliana and Corin continued to work, to teach, to repair. They taught the children to take apart a relay, not to conquer it, but to understand it. They taught them that being seen should never require becoming someone else's property. They braided their ropes quicker, made their software redundant, built a record of practices that belonged to the settlement and to no ledger in the capital. Sometimes, in the half-light of the workshop, she let herself imagine a different kind of answer, one where the capital learned to recognize the dignity of small labor without needing to own it. The thought felt tender and reckless. It was a hope she could not afford to hold alone, so she shared it with the community, and with Corin, and with the work. They tended it like a system in need of constant maintenance. There were days when the Empire's apparatus looked like a storm on the horizon, and days when its presence was like the faint echo of a passing ship. Neither the capital nor the colony had the power to uproot the other's foundations instantly. What each could do was persist. The capital could promise universes with its language. The colony could make its mornings steady. It was not as grand as the capital's rhetoric promised, nor as small as the capital assumed.
It was a shape of living that required craft, community, and the courage to refuse a comfortable lie. In time, the story the capital would tell about this place would vary, depending on which bureau retold it. In some files, it would be a tale of successful integration. In others, it would be an instance of stubborn localism. The truth would not be singular. It would be braided, like the ropes they made, many strands, each necessary.
On the bench one evening, Corin ran his thumb over the nicked ring again, and then slid it onto Aliana's finger for a moment, as if she might hold the symbol of a past she had never lived. He did not offer it as a claim, and she did not accept it as a crown. It was an exchange of trust, that he had been present, that he would be present still, that their mornings would be theirs to steward. They did not change the balance of power at a stroke. The capital continued to hum in its distant orbits, patient and mechanized. But the settlement, its relay arrays patched, its children learning to solder, its people braided like ropes, had made a different kind of motion. They had chosen to keep their hands on the tools that mattered, to insist, imperfectly and insistently, on the right to repair not only machines, but their own life. When an ambassador from the capital later wrote in an official brief that a renegade artisan had been restored and thus empire was reaffirmed, historians in the capital might one day cut the phrase into neat columns. But the people in the colony, children with solder burns, elders with lists of repairs, a governor who had learned not to confuse applause for authority, knew the truth in the nuisance of the work. They knew how to keep a relay humming, and a furnace stoked, and a community arguing with kindness. At the workbench, under lamps that made the metal,